No discussion about ethics or the contribution of moral thinkers is complete before we discuss who was perhaps the greatest ethical thinker of all time, that was the Buddha, and of course he requires no introduction. But what we need to do in this lecture, in this session, is to go into the details to some extent of what Buddhism actually prescribes, why it has percolated, and it has percolated and become very popular in public discourse. The principles, the techniques, the ideas of Buddhism have found relevance and they have found evidence in science. Okay, based on a lot of reading in the field of cognitive science, also in the field of actual meditative practice, in which I have spent a considerable amount of time in silent meditation retreats. I have undergone a number of silent meditation retreats, all of them in Buddhist meditation techniques, two of which were detailed courses in Buddhism, in which the entire philosophical spectrum of Buddhism, all the ideas are taught and discussed in detail. And I did these courses in Dharamshala, in a Buddhist temple. The fundamental idea of Buddhism is about happiness, if it can be found in a permanent sense or not. And the whole discussion, we'll get into it in a bit of detail so that we know, understand, and appreciate the entire system, because it's important. It is important because a question might come, questions have come. A previous year question of the UPSC ethics paper was, what teachings of the Buddha are relevant in today's life? Discuss. And there have been questions about mindfulness in particular in the ethics paper, in the essay paper. And there are going to be more and more questions regarding not Buddhism particularly, the ideas of practical application which Buddhism and their techniques of mind training are prescribing. Of course, it has become important for one more reason in our discussion for today, is of course that the system is very ethically oriented, and we have to discuss the ethics of Buddhism and the prescriptions of the Buddha to appreciate some ideas. And of course, we will have to go into the direction of the intersection, which we always do in all the lectures, of how Buddhism and good governance intersect, right? What are the applications for administration, for governance? And we'll find some surprising parallels. And we will also visit Emperor Ashoka, Samrat Ashok, who was a great patron of Buddhism, as he had converted to Buddhism, and he was very inspired by these ideas, and then in turn was inspired by the ideas of good governance of Buddhism, which led him to erect all those edicts and to spread that message of good governance, which is what actually got him the epithet of the great Emperor Ashoka. Right? These ideas we'll visit. It could be an interesting discussion into philosophy, psychology, ethics, going back into politics and good governance. You'll enjoy it. And let's talk about Buddhism for a minute, and let's try and appreciate what Buddhism is saying. Essentially, the entire system of Buddhism, including the beliefs, including all the prescriptions, arise from four noble truths. These are the four fundamental assumptions, the four axioms, which the Buddha says are universally true. And the first one is that there is suffering. There is suffering. What they refer to as suffering is not our understanding of suffering. Their understanding of suffering is more sophisticated, more nuanced. The word that is used in Pali is dukkha. Dukkha. And so their dukkha is not the same understanding of the word dukkha that we use in Hindi these days, in which we refer to it as sadness. Mostly we refer to dukkha as emotional sadness, right? But their idea of dukkha is much broader, I would say. And it includes not only coarse suffering, it includes just the bare bones coarse pain which you may experience if you have a cut on your skin, or if you may have a twisted ankle, which can be excruciating. If you have a sprain in your neck, that coarse suffering is of course included in dukkha, but what is also included is dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction. The Buddha is saying that there is suffering in this world in as much as you are constantly in the position of this figure, always trying to be happy, never finding peace, never finding happiness, because the entire universe, the entire world is conditioned according to change. It is constantly changing, and you are attached to things which you cannot control, and therefore you suffer. The first noble truth says that there is suffering. This suffering is because of, there is a cause for suffering. That is the second noble truth, right? That there is a cause for suffering, and that cause for suffering is ignorance. That cause for suffering is attachment. That cause of suffering is craving. The fact that you relate, now again, this concept of craving is not just the craving that you have for cake, or the craving that you may have for alcohol if you prefer that, or whatever craving there might be. No, he's not talking about that type of craving. This is a more sophisticated psychological craving he's referring to, and he's saying that whatever happens to you, whether that's good or bad, or regardless of how you treat it, you get attached to it. You feel that it is happening to you. You are not able to maintain a distance between your thoughts and yourself. A different discussion about what is exactly you, and we'll get into some of those interesting discussions as well. But he's essentially saying you relate to everything too seriously, and you take everything too seriously. You are not able to maintain a distinction between what is happening and who it is happening to. Following that line of reasoning, the third noble truth is that there is an end to suffering, that this attachment, this ignorance, this fundamental craving, this attachment is the reason that there is suffering, that you will constantly suffer. You will suffer until the day or until the time when you give up and you are completely detached. Now, this again, this detachment is a sophisticated concept. It doesn't mean becoming apathetic. It doesn't mean becoming completely ignorant or completely dismissive of reality. It doesn't mean just living inside your head. It means that you are able to maintain a state of objective observation for long durations of time. And if you can do that, apparently you can achieve a state of mental happiness and bliss. Again, this is something which I have not experienced personally for very long periods of time, but there is evidence that when brain scans are taken, monks who have years of meditation practice, brain scans are taken, happiness levels are measured from a number of sources, from brain waves, from brain scans, or whatever mechanisms they have available at their disposal, scientists, to figure out how happy this person is numerically, scientifically. They did that, and so that research does confirm that people who have had a lot of training in meditation are very, very much happier than those who have not. So they definitely are tapping into some source of happiness. Life, definitely. A question which was asked in the UPSC exam just a few years ago, last year in fact, what teachings of the Buddha are most relevant today and why? This understanding of the first noble truth of dukkha, of not finding satisfaction or not finding everlasting happiness, is most certainly very relevant. In today's fast materialistic world, where our attention is constantly diverted, distracted, marketed, and sold by various types of forces around us, whether they be technological or they may be the complexity of our society itself, whatever that might be. One steps into a life which is fast, which is very competitive, which is very stressful, and one definitely finds that one is running on a treadmill. You figure that out soon enough, and you must have already done that because you have been through that rat race of going to college, getting admissions, and this entire rigmarole. Now you are in another one of those, and you may feel like the UPSC clearing the exam is going to be the end all and be all, but unfortunately it is not. And so the Buddha is saying that you need to tap into the inner source of happiness. Stop looking for it outside. He is not suggesting, and it is not a good thing to write in the response to this type of question, that one should completely detach themselves from the world. No, the Buddha suggests a middle path that is also relevant. The middle path suggests no extremes of excesses or luxuries and no extremes of deprivations. No leaving your family or becoming a monk or becoming an ascetic or going and living in the jungle or dedicating your life to Buddhist practice or any type of spiritual practice. And what does this middle path, prescription, translate to for modern prescription, modern life? If a concept which has been in our discussion, relevant to essay, relevant to again this entire discussion, is minimalism. Minimalism. If you talk about minimalism, it is a very closely correlated concept with this middle path. The Buddha is suggesting that you must tap into an internal source of happiness in order to be more happy. He's also suggesting that if you want to be happy, you will have to follow an ethical life. You will have to follow an ethical conduct. You will have to follow the eightfold path. This eightfold path is the fourth noble truth. This eightfold path is the path which prescribes right view, right concentration, right livelihood, and so on. He's suggesting an ethical way of living which will calm down the mind, which will help you go inside to find that source of happiness, which is nowhere to be found outside, which is superior to any source of happiness to be found outside. That is his prescription. That is relevant to today's life. It is being confirmed by science. It is not suggesting to take up Buddhism. It is only suggesting to tap into a state of mindfulness, this discussion of how it is relevant in today's life, this mention of the concept of dukkha, this mention of the middle path, this mention of ethical lifestyle, this mention of present-centered awareness, meditation, mindfulness can come into your discussions in this question or any question of this sort, or any essay of this sort. Okay, you need to understand and be familiar with these ideas. I will of course give you some very good lecture notes which will help guide you, and you can go ahead and figure out more and more of this stuff. Now this discussion about the ideas of Buddhism, how it relates to the Four Noble Truths, how the Four Noble Truths lead to the Eightfold Path, how the Eightfold Path is a system of ethical practice which is aimed at calming the mind and calming the spirit such that happiness, you see, it's a very well-formed system. I hope that you understood it because I have repeated it in various different ways a number of times. In any case, it's there in your lecture notes, you can go through it. Another concept you need to be aware of now that we are talking particularly about ethics, about Buddhism and ethics, is the concept of karma and also the concept of dharma. These are important concepts and they are not easy to grasp. Okay, so karma is a term and a concept that it predates the Buddha, so it's been there for a while. In various religions, you will find that karma essentially relates to right action. Okay, and that's what ethics is all about. But what the Buddha referred to when he spoke of karma was the cause of action, the intention, right? The agency, the thought and the idea behind it. That needs to be correct, the Buddha suggests. So on the night of his enlightenment, one of the insights the Buddha understood was that all beings arise and pass away according to their karmic conditioning. And this is how his system, the Buddhist system, leads to that idea of reincarnation. He suggests that your karmic intentions leaves an imprint on you, whatever you are, and that you, when your body passes, when your body finishes or dies, when at the moment of death, is passed on, and that karmic score, that karmic tally influences your next life, and so on and so on and so on. And therefore, living ethically is fundamental to Buddhism. It's not just a prescription on the side. Do this also. It is you must do this to do everything else and to achieve happiness and to get rid of this constant cycle of suffering. Living ethical is a foundation. Okay, it is just the entire system is balanced around it. There is something called the wheel of dharma in Buddhism, which you'll also find inscribed in the Ashoka's thumb. That wheel of dharma is essentially what I'm talking about, this entire cycle. And that's idea of circularity, of how the entire system is built on various different spokes, is quite central to Buddhism. We won't get into that. But suffice it to say that the Buddha is encouraging us, he is teaching us to examine constantly whether or not what we think, do and say causes harm or to ourselves and to others. Again, very close to the definition of what we have described as ethics. We said in our first lecture that ethics is always about the other person. Here we have the Buddha suggesting that living ethically is always about you considering the other person. In fact, the idea of compassion, which we have spoken about before, is also completely central to the Buddhist precept, to the Buddhist doctrine, the idea of compassion, of you having an active interest in the welfare of the other person, is essential to not only good governance, but to you becoming a good human being and to you yourself achieving happiness. See, there is a difference here. Here in Buddhism, the idea of compassion, what they call is metta. Metta means loving kindness. They have different meditation practices for it. It is a very central part of their entire system, compassion. It is deeply influenced by this idea of compassion. Now, I should mention here that compassion is not just sympathy or empathy. Empathy is when you feel and you put yourself in the shoes of the other person and you feel their pain. Okay? It is an aspect of emotional intelligence, but it does not involve or it does not assume any element of action. Empathy doesn't say that you will act on that feeling of understanding the other person's pain. Compassion is when you have had the empathy, you've had that empathic response, and now you have genuine desire to do something about it and you actually do it. That is compassion. Take empathy, turn it into action, you are doing compassion at that point. Okay, so in Buddhism, and the idea of compassion is very, very central. And it is central not only to their system, it is central to their ethics. It is suggesting that you have to be always good to the other person. You have to be always conscious of your thoughts, of your own actions, of your effect on everything else, all living beings, in as much as it is possible. And the idea of no harm, of compassion, is included in precepts, 5 precepts. You must never kill other living beings. Stealing or taking what is not given is unacceptable. Engaging in illicit sexual intercourse or sexual activity is completely forbidden, unethical. Lying or gossiping is unethical. Taking intoxicants and altering the state of mind is also unethical. These are the precepts of Buddhism. The ethical conduct is taken to such an extent because acting virtuously directly causes the freeing of the mind. Like I said, it all centers around happiness. Everything that they say is going to lead you back to happiness. That includes these precepts, that includes ethics. Here they are suggesting that ethics is not just something you should do for XYZ reason. They are saying ethics is because you should do, you have to do because of your own liberation, because of the freeing of your mind, because of the oppression of your karma, which you must undo, because without you being ethical, your mind will not be free. And you can experience this to some extent yourself. If you do something unethical, your conscience will bother you. What we otherwise call as cognitive dissonance, which we have spoken about in the lecture on attitude. Remember that. The cognitive dissonance cannot allow you to be in a nice, meditative, centered space. It will keep bothering you. You will keep getting thoughts. You will keep getting a repetition of those suppressed feelings in your mind, which is what cognitive dissonance is, right? And it is saying that one must get rid of this. And the only way to get rid of this is to live ethically. And then there are precepts. So it is ethics tied to spirituality. That is the point I am stressing. And how these ideas correspond to good governance. Now, there is a important word which you need to understand. Dasa Raja Dhamma. These are the 10 noble virtues of a king. Okay, this is the closest parallel to good governance in the ancient times. There are 10 virtues which were described in one of the sutras of Buddhism, which prescribe how a king should rule. And we will see how they are very close to the idea of good governance, which is propounded by the World Bank, and how it was that these Dasa Raja Dhamma, these ideas of the 10 virtues of a king, of governance, were influential in changing the ideas of Emperor Ashoka, and how it is these ideas that he used and he spread those ideas. When you hear about his edicts, when you hear about these structures which he had built all across the country, all across the subcontinent, they had text inscribed on it. There was a message. It was basically a pillar which contained an important message. He had those pillars erected because he wanted the message to spread. and he wanted that message to be preserved. Okay, so that's what the ideas that are listed in those edicts, in his pillars, in his edicts, are essentially these ideas. And this is something we need to discuss in some detail, because our subject of discussion, our main interest is, of course, in governance, in ethics, and this is going to come in the exam one way or another. It is very possible that you will have a separate question on the 10 virtues of governance of Buddhism, and how they may have impacted Emperor Ashoka, how they are relevant in good governance today. A topic in previous year paper was what are the seven social sins of Gandhiji, and now that is a concept which you need to be aware of, right? And we did speak about that, these social sins of Gandhiji in a previous lecture, and it is in that spirit that a particular type of question, if it arises, very particular, when you require the knowledge of it, this is one of those questions in my hit list which might appear. So please do listen carefully. What are the 10 royal virtues? The 10 royal virtues are called Raj Dhamma in Buddhism. There are other Dhamma or principles taught by sages from the past, and they may be different types of precepts, but the 10 royal virtues. And now Buddhism has had a important influence on the idea of governance. The 10 royal virtues of Buddhism are mentioned in this diagram. We'll go through each one of these briefly, and then we'll see how they correlate and how much they overlap with the modern idea of good governance, and how also Emperor Ashoka took these precepts and how he used them. The first one is dana. Dan. This is the idea of generosity. This is caring. Okay, it does not obviously mean simply donating to beneficents, but somewhat you cherish as near and dear person for the benefit of anybody else. It also has different significant meanings in Buddhism. It refers to almsgiving, liberality, offering, dealing. The Buddha mentioned 8 objects suitable for gifts: food and drink, clothes and transport, garlands, perfumes, bedding, dwelling, etc. etc. A donor should have to good purpose of selfish kindness. Loving kindness, compassion, assistance to others to release from suffering are good virtues. Now, these are the Buddha's words himself when he's referring to Dan, when he's referring to this first royal virtue. He who gives alms, he says, bestows a fourfold blessing. He helps to long life, good appearance, happiness, and strength. Therefore, long life, good appearance, good behavior, peace and happiness and strength will be his share, whether amongst heavenly beings or amongst men. So in this context of the 10 royal virtues and how they relate to good governance, Dan refers to giving way of alms to the needy. And this is where the idea of the welfare state may also be linked to these 10 royal virtues, particularly of taking care of the needy. And now this, of course, includes all sectors of society which require assistance. That includes the elderly, that includes transgender people, that includes all the debates that we hear about the differently abled people, and the type of care that the state can provide is prescribed in this particular royal virtue. Second one, I think, is most important and most directly links to ethics. It's called Shila, Sheel, right? Shila or morality. This is, of course, in other words, the entirety of the discussion that we've been having. So it's a Pali word, and in Shila one has to develop control of the mind. Okay, this control of the mind is called samadhi or concentration of mind. Shila is a mind and volition manifested in speech or bodily action. It is the foundation of the entire Buddhist practice. It is high moral character. It refers to high moral character, and it has been made one of the most important 10 royal virtues. The need for morality comes from the fact that naturally man is not perfect. To be good, he needs a lot of training. In this aspect, morality has become very significant for living. Now, in Buddhism, Shila is the only way to reach the ultimate goal of peace and happiness. Again, it is morality, spirituality tied to happiness. So, this is a system in which you can experience discussions of philosophy, of ethics, of psychology, leading to governance and prescriptions of not only how to live life, but how to govern the lives of other people, right? So Buddha was encouraged, and he has been referring to this idea of self-sacrifice also, which is the third one, parityaga, or in Pali, parichaga. Parichaga. Parichaga means self-sacrifice. This is the idea of self-sacrifice, which is very important, I think, which can also be linked to the idea of probity in governance. Now, we have not discussed probity in governance, but suffice it to say that you need to have an element of self-sacrifice in order to be a very good civil servant. The fourth is ajava. Ajava means honesty and absolute integrity. Again, this fourth precept, this fourth royal virtue forms a part of our entire discussion about integrity in civil services, about good governance, and so on. It's been made central, and we'll have a lot to say about this. I will not get into the details of these particular 10 royal virtues. You should just know them. I will include these in your lecture notes. I don't want you to get into the details of anything else at this moment, but just know that these 10 royal virtues were prescribed. They form the basis of the ethics of good governance, which Emperor Ashoka practiced and he tried to spread in his edicts. And these ideas also form the basis of, well, not the basis perhaps, but they definitely mirror to a large extent the idea of good governance as the World Bank has propounded it. And so, very briefly, I'll take you through Emperor Ashoka's intersection and his appearance in this lecture. He had a major role to play in spreading Buddhism in the subcontinent. He placed harmony at the pinnacle amongst all the subjects in his reign. He deeply believed that people of all religion, race and caste and creed can live in the state. That he believed that all are equal. He tried to ensure the equal rights for the well-being of all subjects. He also emphasized unity. But he emphasized unity through non-violent means. This idea of ahimsa had become central to him. And so had the idea of compassion. He also emphasized that he was a kind-hearted person, first of all, right? He loved everyone like his child. The evidence lies in the Kalinga edicts. Here in the Kalinga edicts, he writes, all men and children, and just as I desire for my children that they may enjoy every kind of prosperity and happiness, both in this world and the next, so also I desire for all men. This is he saying, referring to his ideas about his subjects and about humanity at large. So he's not a misanthrope, and he has the best of blessings and the best of wishes, or at least the edict says so in the prescription. Let us now come to the discussion of how the 10 royal virtues correspond to the idea of the World Bank. You can see that the United Nations idea of good governance involves these 8 fundamental precepts, these 8 fundamental ideas about how governance should be run, that the governance structure should not be elitist, it should be participatory, there should be a rule of law, which should ensure equality, it should ensure equity, in fact. There should be transparency, responsiveness, consensus orientation, equity, inclusiveness, effectiveness, and efficiency and accountability. These are the fundamental 8 ideas of good governance, which different policies and different governments are supposed to try and ensure. Now, in Buddhism, the corresponding principle to the second one, for instance, is Shila, right? The rule of law, Shila, is morality, is referring to morality. Transparency in good governance refers to this entire idea of having information publicly available. It is what e-governance aims to achieve when governance mechanisms, for instance, auctions, for instance, any type of information which can be perhaps misused, which is of public interest, should be available. And this involves the idea of transparency and integrity. Of course, that is an entire section of our debate, because we are talking about the ethics section. Responsiveness corresponds to Dan, Madhava, kindness, gentle, mindness, and the softness. Consensus orientation, equity, inclusiveness, And regarding this topic, I will add a important paper, a research paper about these parallels. It is about 10 or 20 pages. I would like you to go through it. It will be quite instructive. But it would be good for me to end this lecture without going into more detail, but I would like to emphasize here a few points. One, I have told you how the idea of ethics in Buddhism relates to spirituality. I have told you how that spirituality relates to the psychology of happiness, how these ideas can address our approach to modern life. Then we went on to discuss how those ideas are used in good governance. We found a particularly relevant section of Buddhist prescription of the 10 royal virtues. We then discussed how these 10 royal virtues influenced Emperor Ashoka, who spread those ideas, which were then adopted also in modern India. In fact, it has been inscribed and actually officially taken to be the national emblem, the Ashoka's thumb, where the wheel of Dhamma is inscribed in the middle, if you've seen it. And then we saw how the modern idea of good governance, as it relates to public administration, is very closely related to these 10 royal virtues. Okay? And at the root of this entire discussion is the fundamental nature of human existence, which according to the Buddha and according to modern science is suffering or dukkha in the broad sense of the word. It is not a pessimistic idea that there is suffering in the world. The idea is a powerful one. It suggests that there is dissatisfaction in the world, that the existence and the marks of existence, the way the universe is structured, the way the mind works, is not prone to happiness. In the end, I would like to simply take you to I'll leave you with an interesting thought. In fact, I will just leave that thought with you to expand your mind so that you may think about it. It's food for your brain. You see, when evolution was creating different organisms, and it creates different organisms not because it wants to, it just creates. It keeps on experimenting and experimenting and experimenting with different mutations until different organisms arise. And these organisms, if the mutation is good, if the mutation is suitable, this is called natural selection, but if the mutation is good and if that gives the organism some advantages, those advantages lead that organism to survive more, and then that organism survives more and therefore reproduces more, and therefore that mutation spreads. Okay? And what appears to have happened, what evolutionary psychology is suggesting, is that this has happened to humans. Of course, it has happened to humans. And we have inherited genetically the tendency to worry, the tendency to have our ideas always running towards the future or towards the past. Perhaps this was because the ancestors that you had, the ancestors that I had, all of our ancestors thousands of years ago, the ones who had the tendency to worry more survived because they were able to fend off danger. They were more vigilant than those who did not have that ability. And because they had it, because they survived more, because they had longer lifespans, because of this tendency to worry, they reproduced more. And as a result, we all have the same tendencies today. But the issue is this. This tendency may have ensured survival, but it does not ensure any happiness. It has got nothing to do with happiness. All nature cares about, all this blind mechanism of evolution cares about, is passing those genetics from one generation to the next. It is not concerned with your happiness or my happiness or anybody's happiness. In as much as it is concerned, happiness is irrelevant as long as the genes are passed on from one generation to another. It found a good way to pass on those genes in the mind while creating this and complex creature of humans, and it figured out a way to do that. The more they worry, the more likely they are to pass on their genes. Okay, and what Buddhism is prescribing, or what many ethical principles are prescribing, including in as much as happiness is concerned, is that you must break away from this tyranny of your genetics, and that happiness is not given, and it is not a biological heritage It is not a biological precondition. In fact, you are designed not to be happy for the most part. Designed and created to worry. Of course, there is unhappiness. Of course, the result is that we are always stressed out, that we are never finding peace, that we are always curious. Of course, it is also the reason that we continue to progress, that we continue to hustle. But on an individual level, it takes a toll on us. And we would like to have control. Perhaps, even after taking the control, perhaps you follow all these ideas of Buddhism and you become very adept at controlling the mind and you have access to happiness. At least you should have the choice. So with the choice given by being mindful, by being present centered, by being conscious of everything that's happening, by not giving into emotions, by not giving into fleeting ideas, by not giving into sensations or feelings of jealousy, of anger, of over happiness, of mania, or of depression, by having that choice, you can make better decisions. You can then control what to do, and that is the central assumption, central requirement for ethical living. You see, because there can be no ethics without having control. You understand? Of course, ethics requires a huge deal of thinking, of cogitating, of figuring out what is right and what is wrong. You can't have any choice if you are constantly being swept away in various stops of emotions. That is the natural biological way you have been created. Mindfulness gives you the choice to figure out, to have that choice, to have that, at least to have that remote control. Even if you have it for a few moments a day, that is the central precondition for ethics. It also happens to be the central precondition for happiness. It's interesting food for thought. And with that, I'll leave you and I will see you next time.